Alright, well, welcome to Team SNG deck profile. Today we're going to be doing the Orcust profile, and this is going to be the first of 4 lore-based decks, which will be coming to the channel over the next few weeks. Next week we will focus on Albaz Pure, then we'll focus on Spriggan's Albaz, and finally on the Tri-Brigade, incorporating the new Link 2. Make sure you leave us a like, comment, and do subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming lore-based profiles. So, Orcust is an interesting deck. It was really popular a few years ago during what was called the Eternal format. This sharing a piece of the pie with Sky Striker and Thunder Dragon. This is part of the World Legacy lore as well, so I really like the lore-based decks that Konami's been putting out recently. And I've kind of wanted to build this, but I've never really figured out how to build it without Harp Horror, who has been banned due to the transgressions this deck had within the meta. However, I think I've come up with a pretty decent build here. It's about control and stunning out your opponent. That all being said, let's get into it. So, starting off with our monsters, the first monster is used in one of my other lore-based decks in Crusadia Mech Knight. And he's really the main playstarter of the deck, and that is 3 copies of Orcust Mech Knight Girsu. Girsu the Orcust Mech Knight. What this card does is, when it is summoned, it lets you send from deck to grave an Orcust or a World Legacy card. So, you can send any of your Orcust monsters, which will help you continue comboing off, or you can send the World Legacies, and we run quite a few in this deck. Next we run Orcust Symbol Skeleton. We run 3 copies of this. You manage this from your grave to special summon an Orcust monster from your graveyard, so it just helps you continue putting things on the board. Following him, we also run 1 copy of Orcust Brass Bombard. Orcust Brass Bombard, you can banish to special summon an Orcust from your hand. So, again, it can be really useful. Also, him being a level 1 means you can search for him using 1 for 1, and you can link him off for Link Karibo if you need to. So, he can also be a bit of a playstarter, but we only run 1 because he's a little less convenient than a lot of the other Orcusts that we run in the deck. And the final Orcust monster we run is Orcust Nightmare. Orcust Nightmare is good for graveyard setup, in the fact that you can target a monster on your field and then send from your deck to grave a Dark Machine, which will then increase the monster you targeted's attack by 100 for each of that monster's level. So starting off with our World Legacy lineup, we have 2 copies of World Legacy World Wand. So this has 2 effects. One is, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can special summon a World Legacy monster from your hand. And again, that partners up with one of our spells, because our spell might send this to the grave, but let us add a different World Legacy, so it kind of works out. Next, we've got World Legacy World Crown. World Crown is an extender. Once we have a Link monster on board, we can special summon it. The other thing is, while it's on the field, it can act as a negate of a monster special summon from the extra deck. What you do is you tribute it when your opponent activates a monster from the extra deck's effect, and it negates the effect. Next, we run 1 copy of World Chalice. World Chalice is, again, another searcher, and typically what you're going to want to send off of Orcust Mech Knight Girsu if you've got other ways of getting your Orcusts into the grave. Otherwise, you're probably going to still want to send off an Orcust monster. And finally, we run World Legacy World Lance. World Lance is basically an honest in hand. You can pitch it to decrease the attack of a monster attacking one of your Link monsters by 3,000. So that can be really useful because it protects your monsters on the field. Also, if you get this card on the field and you special summon a monster from your extra deck, it will produce you a World Legacy token on your side of the field and 1 on your opponent's side of the field, which, not the end of the world. The other thing this does is it grants battle protection to your other World Legacy monsters on the field. So if you end up with like a World Legacy World Lance and a World Legacy World Chalice on the field, if your opponent went to attack, they have to attack World Lance before World Chalice. And he's a nice 3k beater, so it's not the end of the world that we got him in here. I definitely think all 3 of these have their utility, and I found this is the best ratio to run them in. Finally, another playstarter that we run that's not the optimal one, because obviously the optimal one is our Orcust Mech Knight Girsu, is 3 copies of Mathematician. Mathematician just lets you send a level 4 or lower monster from your deck to the grave, so it'll let you send off your Symbol Skeleton, your Orcust Mech Knight, or your Brass Bombard, whichever one is the right one to send at that time. And finally, we also run a Phantom Knights package in this deck if you want. And so that is the Phantom Knights of Silent Boots to partner up with the Bardiche in the extra deck. This is for our monsters. Onto our spell traps. So we run quite a few spells. So the first and primary card that we run is 3 copies of Orchestrated Babel. Orchestrated Babel is the field spell for Orcusts. It makes it so all your Orcust monsters' effects act as quick effects, meaning that you can use them at any point on your opponent's turn, and that gives you a lot of the interruptions that we like to have access to in this deck. The other thing is, if this is in the grave, other than the turn it was sent there, you can actually discard a card to add it back to your hand, meaning you can use it for graveyard setup in that sense, but you're not losing anything because you're getting this back to your hand as well. We also run some draw power in our Orchestrated Return, which lets us send World Legacy or Orcust monsters from our hand to draw 2 cards. So we send 1 and draw 2. It's effectively like trade-in, but for Orcust and World Legacy monsters. And seeing as we run quite a few of each, we should be able to use this almost any time we see it in our hand. Onto the World Legacy spell lineup we run 2 copies of World Legacy Succession, and the tech card of the deck is 3 copies of World Legacy Survivor. Now this is a card that is typically used in crawlers, and if you haven't checked out our crawler deck profile, I'd highly recommend it. I think it's still quite accurate. It hasn't needed an update in a while. World Legacy Survivor is really interesting because you excavate the top 5 cards of your deck, and then you add a crawler or a World Legacy card from the cards excavated to your hand. The rest of the cards then go to the grave. Seeing as this is such a grave-centric deck, realistically, we are in fantastic shape putting 4 cards in our grave. Finally, we run some 1-ofs in 1-for-1, Terraforming, and Card Destruction. None of these cards really hurt us. They're all very useful. Graveyard setup plus Brass Bombard, that's good. Terraforming means we get our Babel out, so effectively we're just running 4 copies of it. And Card Destruction, we don't mind our stuff being engraved, so it sets ourselves up quite well. Onto our traps. Starting off with the main trap for the Orcust engine that we run 3 copies of Orcust Crescendo. So Crescendo is really good. If a spell, trap, or monster effect is activated while you control an Orcust link, you can activate this and negate the activation, and then Orcust Crescendo banishes it, which is really nice because it doesn't put it in grave for our opponent to use later. The other thing this does is, if this is in your grave, you can banish it from your graveyard to add from your deck or from your banish pile to your hand a Dark Machine monster. But this does lock you into Dark Machines for the entire turn, so you do have to be careful about when you use its search effect. However, most of the time, you're not going to use its search effect until later in the game. It's more of a grindy sort of effect that this card grants the Orcust deck. The last Orcust trap that we run is Orchestrated Core. I only run 1 because you can search for it, and it's not necessarily an important card every time. What it does is, once per turn, you can banish a monster from your grave, and that can be any monster. Then you can target one of your Orcust or World Legacy monsters on the field, and your opponent can't target them with card effects, so it's basically just targeting protection. The other thing is, if any of your World Legacy or Orcust cards were to be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can actually send this card from the field to the grave instead to just sort of give them that extra protection. Finally, a few more traps that we run, just to make the control variant of this deck really apparent. 2 copies of Dark Sacrifice, and this is a nice little tech card the deck has access to. If your opponent activates an effect that will destroy a card on your side of the field, you can negate the effect, and then send from your deck a level 3 or lower Dark Monster, meaning you could send your Phantom Knights Silent Boots if you haven't already sent it, or you could send one of your Orcust monsters in your Symbol Skeleton or your Brass Bombard. So this can help set your grave up for the next turn, and that puts you in good shape. That is it for our main deck. Onto the extra deck. So the first monsters we're going to talk about in the extra deck are obviously our Orcust monsters. We run 3 copies of Galatea. This is the main playmaker of the deck. It's a Link 2. It requires 2 effect monsters, including an Orcust monster. So you do need to make sure you get an Orcust on field to do this. However, that's not too difficult with our Girsu Orcust Mekk-Knight. What this will then let you do is you can shuffle in one of your banished Dark Machines into your deck, and then that'll let you set directly from the deck an Orcust spell or trap. So you could set your Crescendo, or you could set your Babel if you haven't managed to see your Babel. Also, while Galatea is linked, it can't be destroyed by battle, meaning that your opponent's going to need to destroy it by card effect. Next is 2 copies of Longirsu, the Orcust Orchestrator. He's your Link 3, and he requires 2+ effect monsters, including an Orcust monster, so you could climb into him from your Galatea. On top of that, he can let you shuffle in 2 of your banished Dark Machine monsters to send a linked monster that your opponent controls to the graveyard. So you can use this to get rid of extenders that your opponent might have put on the field, but it's just a nice little card for us to have access to. On top of that, it partners really well with one of the other cards we're running in our extra deck that can act as a bit of a boss monster for the deck. The last thing is that Longirsu, much like Galatea, when he is linked, is protected, but he's protected from card effects. The final boss monster we run in the Orcust lineup is 1 copy of Orcustrion. Orcustrion's really interesting because it's a Link 4 with 3000 attack. And what it can do is, while it is linked, it can't be destroyed by battle or card effect, which is really nice. And you can shuffle in 3 of your banished monsters to decrease the attack of any linked monster your opponent controls to 0. The one thing is you do need to be aware, though, that he does require you to be linked to them, so you're going to need to make sure that your opponent is running a link-based deck to get the most out of him. To top that off, he can't be destroyed by card effect or battle whenever he's linked. So if you ended up with him and your Longirsu underneath one another, now your opponents are probably going to be in quite a rough space. We also run a couple XCs for our Orcust lineup, and that is 2 copies of Dingirsu. Dingirsu is the main boss monster type thing for this deck. When it is special summoned, you can activate one of 2 effects. You can either send a card from your opponent's side of the field to the grave, or you can attach a banished card to it as material. If a card or cards on your side of the field would be destroyed by card effect, you can detach a card from this to protect that monster. So this basically just gives us the ability to protect our field and the monsters on it. Onto our generic Link package that we run. We run 1 Link Karibo, just because he partners with our Brass Bombard quite well. We run 1 IP Masquerena, just a nice extender. We run 1 Lib, the World Key Blade Master, because she can set our World Legacy survivors to the field if we haven't seen it, to further set up our grave. As alluded to, we run 1 copy of Bardiche, just because the additional negates are really nice. We run a copy of Trispania to help us deal with pesky back row. Our stuff being banished isn't great, but sometimes we just need to bite the bullet and banish our spell traps to put our opponent on their back foot. Then we run Topologic Bomber Dragon, and this is the Link 4 boss monster of the deck, because what you can do is, if a monster is summoned to a zone a Link monster points to, you basically blow up everything in the main monster zones. But if you can put your Longirsu under this, he won't be destroyed by card effect, and all of your opponent's stuff will be. So this is the old strategy for Orcusts, and bringing back your Longirsu with Symbol Skeleton on your opponent's turn and board wiping them. And finally, we do run Mekk-Knight Crusading Avermax, because IP Masquerena plus Lib into your Avermax is really nice if you can get to it. So that does it for our extra deck. So my final thoughts on this deck, well, it's an old deck that has definitely been power crept over time, but the addition of Girsu the Orcust Mekk-Knight definitely does give us more consistency, considering the fact that the main play starter for the deck is currently sitting on the ban list. His ability to send Symbol Skeleton and set our graveyard up, while also letting us get straight into a Galatea by using him and the token as material, is really nice. On top of that, we have other monsters to facilitate ourselves, like our Longirsu, to send linked monsters to the grave, and our Dingirsu being able to send anything when it is summoned to the grave as well. The fact that Dingirsu can be overlaid straight onto Galatea or Longirsu is also a really nice little touch. And the best thing about this deck is the ability to have everything turned into quick effects with our Orchestrated Babel. If that wasn't enough, well, we also have a control element with our Orcust Crescendo. The consistency of the deck is definitely been hit, as I stated, by the loss of Harp Horror, but the interesting tech choice of World Legacy Survivor is really nice, and the fact that we run a large enough World Legacy package to make this viable is also a useful thing. That being combined with the control elements of a Rusty Bardiche and Fogblade is also very nice, and finally being able to use board wipe after board wipe on our opponent's turn can also be a problem for our opponents. This deck definitely suffers when it's not playing against link-based strategies though, because a lot of the effects require you to have monsters linked to best utilize their abilities. That being said, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Make sure to leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe. Check out one of these two videos here, and I'll see you guys at the next video.